Every wolf in the garrison hall had dropped to their knees the moment King Casimir Valen stepped through the doors. Every wolf, except one. The dominance hit first, the way it always did. It rolled ahead of him like a pressure wave, dense and suffocating, pressing down on the spines and throats of every living creature in its path. Guards who had served the crown for 20 years buckled where they stood. A serving girl near the hearth let out a strangled whimper and pressed her forehead to the floor. Even the warhounds chained by the far wall flattened their bellies against the stone and went silent. The entire hall submitted in the span of a single breath, except for the woman kneeling beside a wounded soldier on the far bench, wrapping a linen bandage around his forearm with quick, practiced hands. She did not look up. She did not flinch. She did not so much as pause in her work. Casimir noticed her immediately. Not because she was remarkable to look at, though something about the way the firelight caught in her dark auburn hair made his gaze linger longer than it should have. He noticed her because in a room full of wolves, pressed flat by the weight of his presence, she was the only one still moving. He watched her tie off the bandage with a neat knot, murmur something to the soldier that made the man attempt a weak smile, and pat his arm twice. Then she stood, brushed her skirt with both hands, and turned toward the door. She walked directly toward him, not with defiance, not with bravery, with the casual, distracted stride of a woman whose mind was already on her next task. She was 3 steps away when she finally registered the enormous obstacle in her path, looked up and met his eyes. Nothing happened. No flinch, no gasp, no instinctive baring of her throat, no tremor in her hands or hitch in her breath. She looked at him the way she might look at a wall. She needed to walk around. "Oh, pardon me." She stepped to the side, moved past him, and kept walking. The silence that followed was so absolute, Casimir could hear the fire popping in the hearth. His beta, Hadian, stood frozen by the doorway, his mouth slightly open, his hand still resting on the pommel of his sword, as if he had forgotten it was there. Casimir turned and watched her walk away. Her footsteps were unhurried, calm. She pushed open the heavy garrison door without looking back and disappeared into the corridor beyond. "Who?" Casimir said quietly. "Was that?" Hadian closed his mouth, opened it again. "Closed it." "I asked a question," the king said. Hadian recovered with visible effort. "I will find out immediately, Your Majesty." This was not how the afternoon was supposed to go. The king had come to the garrison to inspect the wounded from the border skirmish. A routine visit meant to remind his soldiers that their king had not forgotten them, even if he could no longer touch them, comfort them, or stand close enough to speak without watching them crumble under the weight of what he had become. The woman had been there for a simple reason. The garrison healer was overwhelmed, and someone had sent word to the castle's apothecary for an extra pair of hands. Vedrana, the head healer, had dispatched her youngest and most capable herbalist to wrap wounds and apply poultices. Her name was Tindra. She had no family name because she had no family. She had been left on the steps of the lower keep, as an infant, wrapped in a wool blanket, with no note and no explanation. Vedrana had taken her in, raised her alongside tinctures and dried herbs, and trained her into the best wound dresser in the castle. Tindra had lived her entire 23 years in the lower quarters. She had never spoken to a noble. She had certainly never spoken to a king, and she had not intended to speak to one today. But none of that explained what Casimir could not stop thinking about as he stood in the garrison hall, staring at the door she had vanished through. It did not explain why his dominance, the crushing, uncontrollable force that had been radiating from him like heat from a forge for over a year, had not touched her at all. He found her in the corridor. She was walking briskly, a canvas satchel over one shoulder, already pulling dried lavender stems from a pouch and sorting them into bundles as she moved. She did not hear him approach, or if she did, she gave no indication. "Wait," he said. She turned, saw him, and looked mildly surprised. "Your Majesty, did you need something from the apothecary?" The question was so ordinary it stunned him. Nobody spoke to him like that anymore. Nobody spoke to him at all unless they had to, and when they did, it was through gritted teeth and trembling jaws, their wolves screaming at them to submit and flee. "Give me your hand," Casimir said. Tindra blinked at him. "I beg your pardon." He did not wait. He reached out and took her wrist. The contact was immediate and devastating, but not in the way it should have been. When Casimir touched any wolf, his dominance surged through the point of contact like a current. That staggered, omegas, collapsed. Even other alphas flinched and pulled away, their wolves recoiling from the sheer magnitude of what poured out of him. Tindra looked down at his hand on her wrist. Then she looked back up at his face. "Are you feeling all right, Your Majesty?" she asked. "You look a bit pale." Casimir could not speak. The warmth of her skin against his was so shocking, so unbearably foreign after 14 months of absolute isolation that for a moment his vision blurred. He was touching someone. He was holding another person's wrist, and she was not screaming, was not pulling away, was not dropping to the floor with her hands over her ears. She was looking at him with mild concern and a growing hint of confusion, as if she were trying to decide whether the king had lost his mind. His fingers tightened around her wrist, without his permission. "Your Majesty," she said carefully, tugging her arm back slightly. "You are holding on to me quite firmly." Footsteps echoed from the end of the corridor. Paladion rounded the corner at a near run, took in the scene, and went absolutely still. The beta's gaze moved from the king's hand wrapped around the herbalist's wrist to the expression on his king's face, an expression Halion had not seen in over a year, and the color drained from his cheeks. "Don't move," Halion said to Tindra, his voice low and urgent. "Do not pull away from him." Tindra looked from the beta to the king and back again, and for the first time, something uncertain flickered across her face. "What?" she said slowly. "Is happening right now?" Neither of them answered her. Tindra did not get an answer that night. She was escorted to a small chamber near the upper quarters by a guard who refused to make eye contact, given a meal she was too bewildered to eat, and told to remain until morning. She sat on the edge of an unfamiliar bed in an unfamiliar room and stared at her wrist. There was nothing there. No mark, no bruise, no lingering warmth, just skin. She pressed her thumb to the spot where the king's fingers had been, and felt absolutely nothing remarkable. "So why?" she whispered to the empty room. "Did he look at me like that?" She barely slept. Her mind cycled through the same questions until the gray light of dawn crept through the narrow window. What had she done wrong? Was ignoring the king in the garrison some kind of offense she did not know about? Was there a protocol for encountering royalty that nobody had thought to teach the foundling herbalist from the lower keep? She had almost convinced herself. She was about to be punished when the door opened, and Hadion stepped inside. "Miss Tindra," the beta said, his voice carefully neutral. "The king requests your presence." Requests. Not demands, not commands. The word choice did nothing to ease the dread coiling in her stomach. The walk to the king's study took an eternity. Halion moved in silence beside her, and Tindra noticed that every servant they passed in the corridors pressed themselves against the walls, eyes down, breathing shallow. The closer they got to the king's wing of the castle, the worse it became. A maid carrying a stack of linens was visibly unsteady on her feet. A page boy sat on a bench, with his head between his knees, looking ill. "Is everyone in this part of the castle feeling unwell?" Tindra asked. Halion glanced at her sideways. "You genuinely don't feel it, do you?" "Feel what?" The beta stopped walking. He turned to face her, fully, and his expression shifted from careful neutrality to something that looked dangerously close. "To hope. When you walk into a room and the king is there," Halion said slowly, "what do you experience?" Tindra frowned. "I experience a room with the king in it. Nothing else. No pressure in your chest, No instinct to lower your eyes, no tightness in your throat. No, Tindra said, growing uneasy. Should there be? Halion let out a breath that seemed to carry a year's worth of weight. Come with me, he said. There is something you need to understand before you see him. He led her into a small antechamber off the main corridor and shut the door. His next words came measured and precise, the way a man speaks when he has rehearsed something difficult. 14 months ago, the king led a campaign against the Scarvain Pact, a coalition of rogue pacts that had been raiding our southern territories. The war lasted 3 months. During the final siege, the king was forced to unleash the full extent of his dominance to break their lines. The force of it was... Hadian paused, choosing his words. Unprecedented. It ended the siege in minutes. It also killed wolves on both sides who were standing too close. The color left Tindra's face. Since that night, his dominance has not receded, Hadian continued. It radiates from him constantly. The radius has been expanding for months. At this point, no wolf can be in the same room with him for more than a few minutes without experiencing severe distress. Physical contact causes immediate pain. Omegas cannot endure his presence at all. The word settled over her like cold water. Omegas cannot endure his presence, she repeated. But I am an Omega. Yes, Halion said. You are. And yesterday you stood 3 feet from the most dominant alpha in recorded history, looked him in the eye, and asked him to pardon you for being in the way. Silence stretched between them. His Majesty has not touched another person in over a year, Haladion said quietly. You are the first. Tindra opened her mouth and no sound came out. She thought of the king's fingers closing around her wrist in the corridor. The way his grip had tightened like he was holding on to something precious that might disappear. The expression on his face that she had not been able to name at the time but could name now. It had been relief. Pure, desperate, overwhelming relief. You want to know why I am not affected, she said. We need to know, Hadion corrected gently. The king's condition is deteriorating. 6 months ago, he could sit in a council meeting for an hour before his advisors had to leave the room. Now they can barely manage 15 minutes. The servants in his wing rotate in shifts because prolonged exposure causes migraines, nosebleeds, and fainting. 3 of his personal guards have requested reassignment. Tindra gazed at him. He is completely alone. The beta did not answer, which was answer enough. The healers have tried everything, Halion went on. Vedrana has exhausted every herbal remedy, every tincture, every suppressant in her stores. Nothing dulls it, nothing even touches it. We have brought in specialists from 4 kingdoms. The consensus is that his dominance has fused with his wolf at a level that cannot be separated without killing him. And then I walked in and felt nothing, Tindra whispered. And then you walked in and felt nothing, Halion confirmed. The study door was heavy oak, carved with the Valen crest. Halion pushed it open and stepped aside. Tindra walked in alone. Casimir stood behind his desk, hands braced on the surface, head slightly bowed as if the weight of something invisible pressed down on his shoulders. He looked worse than yesterday. The shadows beneath his eyes were deeper, the angles of his face sharper. He looked like a man being consumed from the inside by something he could not fight. He looked up when she entered, his gaze locked onto hers and held. Tindra felt her heart stutter, not from dominance, not from pressure or force. She felt nothing from his wolf at all. What she felt was entirely her own, a strange, aching recognition. A pull she could not explain and did not want to examine. Sit down, please, the king said. She sat in the chair across from his desk. He remained standing, watching her with an intensity that made her skin warm. Halion told you, he said. It was not a question. Yes, Your Majesty. A pause. His jaw tightened. And you are not afraid? Tindra considered the question honestly. She was sitting across from a man whose mere presence could bring a trained warrior to his knees. a man whose touch caused agony to every wolf alive. A man who had, by all accounts, become the most dangerous creature in the known world through no choice of his own. "No," she said. "Should I be?" Something gave way in his expression, just for a fraction of a second, and beneath it she saw weariness so deep it made her chest hurt. "Everyone else is," he said quietly. Tindra did not know what possessed her. Maybe it was the healer in her, the part that had spent her entire life reaching toward things that were broken and hurting. Maybe it was something else entirely. Something she would not have a name for until much later. She stood, walked around the desk, and placed her hand on his arm. Casimir flinched so violently the desk shuddered, not from pain, from the sheer shock of being touched. His breath caught, and his entire body went taut beneath her fingers. She could feel him quivering. "When was the last time someone touched you?" Tindra asked softly. He did not answer. He could not answer. His eyes had closed, and every inhale came ragged and uneven, and his hand had come up to cover hers where it rested on his arm, pressing her palm against him as if she might pull away and take the warmth with her. A tear slid down his cheek. He did not seem to notice. Tindra stood very still and let him hold her hand against his arm, and something inside her shifted permanently into place. "I would like you to stay," Casimir said, his voice so quiet she almost missed it. "In the castle near me?" He swallowed. "I understand if you refuse." Tindra looked at the most powerful, most feared, most utterly alone man in the kingdom, and felt her heart fracture clean down the center. "I will stay," she said. The arrangement, as Hadian called it, was straightforward. Tindra would spend several hours each day in the king's proximity. During council meetings, she would sit in a chair along the wall. During his private work hours, she would occupy the reading alcove in his study. During meals, she would be seated at the far end of his table, like a piece of furniture, Tindra said flatly. "Like a stabilizing presence," Halion corrected, with the practiced diplomacy of a man who had clearly managed unreasonable situations before. The first council meeting was a disaster, but not for the reason Tindra expected. She arrived early, took her assigned seat along the wall, and folded her hands in her lap. The counselors filed in one by one, each of them pale and tight-jawed from the effort of enduring the king's presence. Lord Marin, the oldest member, had cotton stuffed in his nostrils to prevent a nosebleed. Commander Jessamyn's grip faltered so badly she could not hold her pen. The royal treasurer walked in, caught one full breath of the king's dominance, and walked directly back out again. Tindra watched this procession with growing horror. She had not truly understood what Hadion meant when he described the king's condition. Seeing it was something else, entirely. Casimir sat at the head of the table, stiff and expressionless, watching his council suffer in his presence without a single flicker of emotion on his face. But Tindra saw his hands beneath the table. They were clenched into fists, so tight the knuckles had gone white. He knew exactly what he was doing to them. He simply could not stop it. The meeting lasted 12 minutes before Hadian called an end to it. The councillors filed out with undisguised relief. Lord Marin removed his cotton plugs and shot the king a look of weary sympathy before the door closed behind him. Casimir remained seated, staring at the empty table. Tindra was supposed to leave with the others. Halion had told her that the sessions would be short at first, that they needed to test the effect of her presence gradually and carefully. She did not leave. "Your Majesty," she said from her chair along the wall, "would you like some tea?" He turned his head slowly and looked at her as if he had forgotten she was there. "What? Tea?" Tindra repeated. "You look like you could use some." "I know I certainly could, after watching your treasurer flee the room like a man escaping a burning building." The ghost of something that might have been amusement surfaced beneath the tiredness etched into his features. "You are not required to stay," he said. "I know," Tindra replied, But the tea in the lower keep is terrible, and I noticed a rather promising tin of Varanthi blend on your shelf. I am not above exploiting a king for access to better tea. The silence that followed was so long, she thought she had committed some catastrophic breach of etiquette. Then Casimir's mouth twitched. The tin is on the second shelf, he said. The cups are behind it. Tindra made tea. She made it the way Vedrana had taught her, slowly and deliberately, letting the ritual of it fill the silence. She set a cup in front of the king, and their fingers brushed as he took it from her. He did not flinch this time. But his grip lingered on the cup a moment too long, his gaze dropping to the place where their skin had touched. She pretended not to notice. They sat in silence and drank tea, and Tindra watched the tension in his shoulders ease by slow, imperceptible degrees. Somewhere around the second cup, his clenched fists loosened. By the third, he had leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. "This is good," he said quietly, and she knew he did not mean the tea. The days took on a rhythm. Mornings in the infirmary with Vedrana, afternoons in the king's presence. The effect became measurable almost immediately. On the third day, the council meeting lasted 28 minutes. On the fifth day, it stretched to 40. Lord Marin removed his cotton plugs entirely and declared that the pressure was, and he used this exact word, tolerable. But the real change happened in the margins. The small private hours when the council had left and it was just Tindra and the king in his study, her in the alcove with a book she had borrowed from his shelf without asking, him at his desk with reports and correspondence. He did not speak to her during these hours, not at first. She would read, or sketch remedies in her journal, or sort the dried herb bundles she carried everywhere. He would work. The fire would crackle, the clock would tick, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, the dominance in the room would thin. "Does it hurt?" she asked one afternoon, looking up from her book. Casimir's pen paused. "Does what hurt?" "The dominance. Carrying it constantly like this." "Does it hurt you?" He was quiet for a long time. "I do not notice it anymore," he said, "the way you stopped noticing the weight of your own bones." Tindra frowned at that. "That is not really an answer." His gaze lifted from his reports, and for a moment he looked at her with an expression she could not read. Surprise, maybe, or something softer. "Yes," he admitted. "It hurts." She nodded. "Then we will fix it." The conviction in her voice seemed to startle him. "You sound very certain for someone who does not know what she is dealing with." "I am a healer," Tindra said simply. "Everything can be healed." He studied her face for a long, searching moment. Then he returned to his work, and she returned to her book, and neither of them mentioned that his hand had been unsteady before she spoke, and that it was not unsteady now. That evening, as Tindra crossed the courtyard toward the lower keep, Vedrana intercepted her at the gate. "How is he?" the old healer asked without preamble. "Lonely," Tindra said before she could stop herself. Vedrana gave her a sharp look. "I asked about his condition, child, not his heart. They are the same thing," Tindra replied, and the words came out with a quiet certainty that surprised them both. Vedrana was silent for several steps. Then she sighed. "Be careful, Tindra. He is a king. You are a foundling, with no name and no pack. Whatever you are feeling, it will only bring you grief." "I am not feeling anything," Tindra said, which was such an obvious lie that Vedrana did not even bother responding. That night, lying in her narrow bed in the lower keep, Tindra pressed her hand against her chest and noticed her pulse was racing. She thought about the way his voice had softened when he said the tea was good, the way his hand had steadied, the way he had looked at her when she said everything could be healed, like no one had ever said anything like that to him before. "I am not feeling anything," she told herself again in the dark. Her wolf stirred beneath her skin and called her a liar. In the morning, a message arrived from Hadian. The king had suffered a severe episode during the night. His dominance had surged while he slept. expanding outward through the castle walls. 14 servants in the east wing had collapsed with crushing migraines. 3 guards had been found unconscious at their posts. A stable boy had been discovered, curled in a ball in the hay, unable to stand. The message was brief and to the point. The king is requesting your presence. Immediately, Tindra was already running before she finished reading. The nighttime surge had left half the east wing uninhabitable. Tindra arrived at the king's chambers to find Halion directing servants to move bedding and furniture out of the affected rooms, his face drawn with the strain of a sleepless night. "How bad was it?" she asked. "Worse than last time." The radius expanded to nearly twice what it was a month ago. Halion lowered his voice. He was alone all night. No one could get near him. The guilt hit her like a fist. She had been asleep in the lower keep, safe and comfortable, while Casimir's power had been tearing through the castle walls and crushing anyone in its path. "I should have been here," she said. "He would not have allowed it," Halion replied. "The arrangement specifies daytime hours only. Then the arrangement needs to change." Halion studied her for a long moment. "Talk to him," the beta said quietly. Casimir was at his desk when she entered his study, and the sight of him nearly stopped her in her tracks. He looked gutted. The bruises beneath his eyes had darkened to something close to black, and the angles of his face were sharper than they had been even a week ago. He was writing, his pen moving across the page in tight, controlled strokes. But she noticed his hand faltered. He did not look up when she sat in her alcove. She did not open her book. "You look terrible." "Thank you. You are welcome. When did you last eat an actual meal?" "I do not recall." "That is not an acceptable answer, Your Majesty." He glanced up at her, and she saw irritation flicker across his features. Good. Irritation meant he was still in there, still present beneath the bone-deep tiredness. "I will eat when I am hungry," he said. "You will eat when I bring you food, because left to your own judgment, you would subsist entirely on black tea and stubbornness," Tindra replied, already rising from her chair. She went to the kitchens and returned with bread, cheese, dried fruit, and a bowl of broth that the cook had been preparing for the evening meal. She set it on his desk, directly on top of the report he was reading. Casimir looked at the bowl of broth, sitting on his correspondence with the Northern Territories. "You have placed soup on a diplomatic document. I have placed nutrition on a piece of paper. One of those things is more important than the other." He looked at her. She held his gaze without flinching. After a long moment, he picked up the spoon and ate. Tindra sat back down and opened her book, hiding her smile behind the pages. The days that followed softened into something warm and quiet. She started bringing meals to his study without being asked. He started leaving a second teacup on the shelf beside the Varanthi blend. She reorganized his herb cabinet because the state of it offended her on a professional level, and he pretended not to notice, even though she caught him reading the new labels she had written. One afternoon, she arrived to find a small vase of wildflowers sitting on the shelf beside her reading alcove. They were clumsily arranged, stuffed into the vase with no sense of composition, and clearly not the work of a servant who would have known better. "These are lovely," she said. "They were already there," Casimir said without looking up from his reports. "They had not been there yesterday." Tindra bit back a smile and did not press him. She filled the silence with stories and observations, and small inconsequential details about her day. About the bees she kept in the lower gardens, and how they recognized her by scent. About the time she accidentally used valerian root instead of vanilla in a batch of calming tea and put the entire night watch to sleep for 14 hours. About the fox that had taken up residence beneath the apothecary steps and refused to be evicted despite Vedrana's increasingly creative attempts. He did not respond to most of these stories, but she noticed that he stopped working when she talked. His pen would go still, his gaze would drift to some middle distance, and the terrible pressure in the room would ease, like a held breath being released. "Your fox," he said one morning, without preamble. Tindra looked up from her herb bundles. "My fox? Beneath the apothecary's steps? You said Vidrana tried smoke. Did it work?" "No," Tindra said, fighting to keep her voice steady against the warmth expanding in her chest. The fox sneezed 3 times, and then fell asleep in the smoke, like it was a personal sauna. Casimir made a sound. Low, involuntary, caught somewhere between a breath and a cough. It took Tindra a full 3 seconds to realize he was laughing. She watched him, transfixed. His face had changed entirely. The guarded composure had broken open, and beneath it was a man who looked younger than she had imagined, softer, almost gentle. The sound faded quickly, as if he did not quite know how to sustain it, but his eyes stayed warm for a long time after. "You should do that more often," Tindra said. "Place foxes beneath your mentor's steps. Laugh." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and for a long, suspended moment, neither of them spoke. Something passed between them in the silence, fragile and unnamed and too important to examine directly. He was the one who looked away first. That night Tindra went to Hallion. "The arrangement needs to include evenings," she said. "His surges happen when he sleeps. That is when he needs me most." Hallion was quiet for a moment. "He will resist. Then, do not give him the option to resist. Move my things to the chamber adjacent to his rooms. If a surge starts, I can be there in seconds." The beta looked at her with an expression she could not quite name. "You understand what you are volunteering for. I understand that 14 people were hurt last night because he was alone. I understand that it will keep happening, and it will keep getting worse, unless someone is willing to be near him when it matters most." She paused. "I am willing." A narrow bed was placed in the small room that shared a wall with the king's chambers. A door connected them, thin enough that she could hear him moving on the other side. The first night was quiet. She lay in the dark and listened to the rhythm of his footsteps as he paced, then the creak of his bed as he lay down, then silence. She pressed her palm flat against the wall that separated them and felt nothing, no surge, just stone and the faint warmth of knowing he was on the other side. In the morning, Hadion reported that the king had slept 4 uninterrupted hours, the longest stretch in months. The second night was quiet too, and the third. On the 4th night, Tindra woke to screaming. Not his. The screaming came from beyond the walls, from the corridors, from the servants' quarters below. A wave of something immense and terrible radiated outward from the room next to hers, and even through the stone it reached her. Not as pain, not as pressure, but as a deep and terrible sorrow that was not her own. She threw open the connecting door and ran inside. Casimir was on the bed, his body locked tense, his hands clawing at the sheets. His eyes were open, but unseeing, rolled back. The muscles in his jaw went white. The dominance pouring off him was visible. The air around him shimmered like heat rising from summer stone, and the walls groaned under a force they were never built to contain. Tindra did not hesitate. She climbed onto the bed, took his face in both hands, and pressed her forehead against his. "Come back," she said. "I am here. Come back to me." His hand shot up and gripped her wrists, not pushing her away, pulling her closer. His fingers dug into her skin with bruising force, and the dominance surged one final time before it collapsed inward like a wave breaking against shore. The screaming stopped. The castle went silent. Casimir's breath slowed, his grip loosened, and his eyes focused on hers. They stayed like that, foreheads touching, her hands on his face, his hands on her wrists, breathing each other's air in the dark. "You came," he whispered. "Of course I came," Tindra said, and her voice broke on the last word. His eyes searched her face, then they dropped to her mouth. Then they closed, and he released her wrists and pulled away, pressing back against the headboard like he needed distance to survive. "Go back to your room," he said. His voice was rough and uneven. I am not leaving, Tindra. No. He watched her. She watched him back. The fire was dead. The only light was the moon, through the window, silver and cold, and in it, his face was laid bare. Weariness, longing, fear. Then stay, he said, and the word sounded like it cost him everything he had. She did not go back to the other room. She curled up on the far side of his bed with 2 feet of space between them, and pulled the blanket up to her chin. Sometime before dawn, she woke to find his hand stretched across the gap between them, his fingers resting against hers on the mattress. He was asleep. Deeply, peacefully asleep. Tindra laced her fingers through his. The ache in her chest was almost unbearable. Sharing the king's bed was, in practice, far more mundane than it sounded and far more overwhelming than Tindra had been prepared for. The bed was enormous. There was technically more than enough room for 2 people to sleep without touching, without even coming close to touching. The problem was not the bed. The problem was him. He radiated warmth like a furnace. She could feel it from 2 feet away, seeping through the sheets, crawling across the mattress toward her, like the heat had a will of its own. His scent was everywhere, in the pillows, in the blankets, in the air. She breathed. It was cedar and iron and something deeper, something wild, that her wolf recognized on a level her conscious mind refused to examine. She lay on her side of the bed each night, staring at the ceiling, every nerve alight, and willed herself to sleep. It took a very long time. But Casimir slept. That was the thing that kept her there through the awkwardness, and the racing pulse, and the growing, aching awareness of him that she could not shut off. He slept deeply and peacefully beside her, and the surges stopped. Haddon reported improved council sessions. The dominance had pulled back to a manageable radius. Lord Marin abandoned his cotton plugs entirely and declared, with the air of a man who had survived a siege, that things were looking up. All because of one Omega herbalist, Lord Marin muttered to Commander Jessamine as they left the council chamber. Tindra overheard and pretended she had not. The nights settled into a pattern. She arrived after the castle quieted, changed behind the screen. He had ordered installed in the corner and climbed into her side of the bed. He was already there, lying on his back, staring at the ceiling, with the tense awareness of a man who was acutely aware of every breath the woman beside him took.
"Good night, Your Majesty,"
she would say. "Good night," he would reply. They did not touch. The hand-holding of that first night was not repeated, and neither of them mentioned it. The 2 feet of space between them became sacred territory, a border neither crossed. She learned things about him in those quiet hours that no one else would ever know. That he ground his teeth when he was fighting sleep, that he sometimes whispered names she did not recognize, names that sounded like prayers or apologies. That on the worst nights his wolf pressed so close to the surface, she could almost see it in the way his body, tensed and coiled under the sheets, fighting something she could not see. She learned that he smelled different when he was dreaming. The cedar deepened, turned almost sweet, and the iron sharpened. She learned that his feet were always cold, which seemed absurd for a man who ran so warm. She learned that once, deep in sleep, he reached for her across the gap, his hand searching the empty space between them before curling into a fist and pulling back. She pretended she had not seen that either until the 7th night. Tindra was deep in dreamless sleep when something shifted. Not sound, not movement. Something beneath her skin, a vibration that resonated in her chest and spread outward through her bones. Her wolf surged to the surface so suddenly. It knocked the breath from her lungs. She opened her eyes and knew immediately that something was wrong. The air in the room had changed. It felt dense, saturated, pressing in from all sides with a weight that was not physical. The moonlight through the window looked wrong, too pale, too sharp, cutting across the floor in angles that did not match the window's shape. And Casimir was not beside her. She sat up. He was standing at the foot of the bed, barefoot, his back to her, wearing only the loose trousers he slept in. Every line of his body was seized tense, and the dominance rolling off him was unlike anything she had encountered before. Not a surge, not a wave, something deeper, older, raw, like standing at the edge of a wound in the world. "Casimir," she whispered. He did not respond. Tindra climbed out of bed and moved toward him slowly. The closer she got, the denser the air became. Not painful, but heavy, with something that tasted like memory, like grief, distilled into atmosphere. She reached out and touched his shoulder. The room vanished. She was standing on a scorched field, beneath a sky choked with smoke. The grass was black. The earth was torn open in furrows that looked like claw marks, and fallen wolves lay across the ground in every direction. Some in armor, some in civilian clothes, some with their hands still reaching toward something. Tindra's legs buckled. She caught herself, her palms pressing into dirt that was still warm. "No," she breathed. The battlefield stretched in all directions, impossibly vast, and at the center of it stood Casimir. Younger, leaner, his face twisted into an expression of such anguish it made her physically ill. His arms were outstretched. His wolf was at the surface, visible in the blazing gold of his eyes, and the way his body seemed to vibrate with barely contained force. She watched him unleash it. The dominance exploded outward from him in a visible shock wave, distorting the air like heat lightning, and everything it touched fell. Wolves dropped mid-stride. Soldiers on both sides collapsed where they stood. A woman, running across the field, with a child in her arms, made it 3 more steps before her knees gave out, and she folded forward over the boy, shielding him with her body as the wave passed through them both. They did not get up. Tindra screamed, but no sound came out. She watched Casimir in the memory fall to his knees, watched his hands press against the scorched earth, watched the horror transform his face as he understood what he had done. What his power had done. The enemies were finished. The siege was broken. And around him in every direction lay the cost. "Make it stop!" Tindra gasped. "Please make it stop!" The memory shifted. She saw the aftermath and fragments. Casimir walking through the field, turning over bodies, checking for breath in lungs that had already emptied. A soldier pulling him away. The child beneath the woman's arms, still and small and gone. Casimir's face as he saw the boy. The way something behind his eyes shattered and did not mend. Then she was back. The king's chambers, the moonlight, the dying fire. She was on her knees on the cold stone floor, and Casimir was standing exactly where he had been. But his hands would not still, and his breath was ragged and shallow. He turned slowly. His eyes found hers in the dark, and what she saw in them made her chest collapse. He knew. He knew. She had seen it. "Now you understand," he said, and his voice was hollow in a way that frightened her more than anything on that field. "That is what I am. That is what lives inside me. That power does not surge because I cannot control it, Tindra. It surges because it is looking for more." "That is not true," she said, but her voice was unsteady. "You saw it," he pressed, his tone flat and merciless. "You stood on that field. You saw what I did to them, the woman, the child, my own soldiers. And you want to tell me the power surging through the walls of this castle every night is a malfunction, that it is something to be healed?" He stepped back from her, putting distance between them like she was something fragile he might shatter. "It is punishment," he said quietly, "and it is earned." He gave the order the next morning. Tindra was not present when he spoke to Hadion, but she heard about it within the hour. Her belongings had already been moved out of the adjacent chamber and placed in a neat pile outside the lower keep by the time she arrived. "He wants you returned to your original quarters," Hadion told her, and for the first time since she had known him, the beta looked defeated. "Effective immediately, no further contact." "He cannot do this," Tindra said, her voice tight. "He is the king," Hadion replied gently, He can do exactly this. Then he is wrong. Hallion did not argue. He simply stood there, looking at her with an expression that said he agreed, but could not say so. She unpacked her things into her old room with hands driven not by fear, but by a fury so intense it frightened her. How dare he? How dare he decide for both of them? How dare he look at that battlefield and conclude that the only possible response was to suffer alone forever? But beneath the anger, already crawling in at the edges, was the absence. She felt it within hours. A thinning in the air, like the atmosphere had lost something essential. A hollowness in her chest that no breath could fill. She pressed her hand to her sternum and felt her pulse beating too fast, too hard, as if it were trying to reach something that was no longer there. By the second day, the migraines returned. Dull at first, then sharpening into something that drove her to her knees in the herb garden, pressing her palms against the cool stone of the pathway until the world stopped spinning. By the third day, she could not eat. Food turned to ash on her tongue. Her wolf, which had been awake and alert for weeks, curled into something small and wounded inside her, and refused to surface. By the fifth day, her hands wavered too badly to grind herbs. She dropped a mortar, and it shattered against the floor, and she sat down beside the broken pieces, and could not find the energy to stand again. Vedrina found her there, and said nothing for a long time. She simply sat down on the floor beside her apprentice, and waited. "You share a bond," the old healer said finally, pressing a cool cloth to Tindra's forehead. "An incomplete one. It formed during those weeks at his side, sealed itself a little more each night you slept near him, and now that you are apart, it is tearing at both of you." "He does not want me near him," Tindra murmured. "He does not want to hurt you," Vedrina corrected sharply. "There is a difference, child, and you know it." Tindra closed her eyes. She knew. Of course she knew. She had seen the way he looked at her in those last moments, as if sending her away was the hardest thing he had ever done, harder than war, harder than a year of isolation. But knowing his reasons did not ease the ache beneath her ribs, and understanding his sacrifice did not stop her body from shutting down in his absence. She tried to carry on. She treated patients, mixed poultices, sorted herbs, with fingers that would not stay still. But the world had gone gray at the edges, drained of color and warmth, and the pull toward him was a constant physical ache that no remedy in her stores could touch. She caught glimpses of him occasionally. A flash of dark hair across the courtyard, his tall frame unmistakable even at a distance. Once she saw him standing at his window, looking down at the lower gardens where she tended her bees, and her chest constricted so painfully she had to turn away. He never looked at her directly, never acknowledged her presence, never gave any sign that her absence cost him anything at all. But across the castle, in the king's wing, things were far worse than his stoic exterior would allow anyone to guess. The reports came to Vedrina through Hallion, who delivered them in clipped, urgent tones. The nighttime surges had returned with catastrophic force. The entire east wing was evacuated permanently. The west wing followed 2 nights later. Guards posted outside the king's chambers could no longer complete their shifts, collapsing within the first hour. Casimir had ordered all personnel moved to the far side of the castle and sealed himself in his wing alone. "He is not eating," Hallion told Vedrina on the 7th day. "He is not sleeping. The dominance is expanding every night. At this rate, the radius will reach the outer walls within 2 weeks. And then?" Vedrina asked. "And then the entire castle becomes uninhabitable," Hallion said. "And we lose him." Vedrina relayed this to Tindra in the infirmary, and Tindra lay on her cot and felt the truth of it vibrate through the connection, like a plucked string. He was dying. She could sense it, not as information, but as sensation, a dimming at the edges of her awareness, a cooling where warmth had been. "I have to see him," Tindra said, sitting up despite the vertigo that slammed into her the moment she moved. You can barely stand, Vedrana pointed out. I can barely stand because I am apart from him. Take me to him, and I will be fine. Vedrana studied her for a long, unreadable moment. This bond will consume you. You understand that. If his condition worsens, you will feel it. If he dies, you will not survive it. Then I had better make sure he does not die, Tindra replied. Vedrana shook her head slowly. But there was something in her eyes, something fierce and sad, and almost proud. You are the most stubborn creature I have ever raised. You taught me well, Tindra said. She made it as far as the courtyard before the bond nearly brought her to her knees. It hit without warning. A searing flare of pain and anguish that was not hers, pouring through the connection like fire through a dry corridor. She gasped, her vision widening out, her legs folding beneath her. She felt the gravel of the courtyard path bite into her palms, felt the sun on the back of her neck, felt distantly the frantic pounding of her own heart. And through their link, threaded through the pain like a voice through static, she felt him. His terror, not for himself, for her. He had felt her collapse. Wherever he was in that sealed wing, surrounded by silence and solitude, and the ever-expanding prison of his own power, he had felt her fall. She heard footsteps, running. The crash of a door thrown open so hard it splintered against the stone wall, and then hands, warm and urgent, sliding beneath her shoulders, lifting her, pulling her, against a chest that heaved with ragged breath. His voice was wrecked, shattered, stripped of every pretense of control. Tindra, open your eyes. She opened them. Casimir's face was inches from hers, and the look on it was one she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Raw, unguarded terror. Tears, he was not aware of, streaking down his cheeks, his hands gentle against her face, as though she were the most precious and breakable thing in the world. I felt you fall, he said, and the words came out fractured. Through the walls, through everything. I felt you fall, and I thought you were. He could not finish the sentence. He drew her against him until there was no space left, until his heartbeat hammered against her own, against her own. The dominance that had been ravaging the castle contracted instantly, pulling back into him like a tide retreating, and the relief was so immediate and so total that Tindra felt the headache that had been crushing her skull for 6 days simply vanish. She pressed her face into his neck and breathed him in, and the connection between them sang, urgent and grateful and alive. You sent me away, she said against his skin. I know, it was the stupidest thing you have ever done. Stupider than eating nothing but black tea for a week. A sound escaped him that was either a laugh or a sob, and he pressed his mouth against her hair and held her there in the courtyard gravel while the castle staff watched from every available window. Vedrana appeared beside them, her expression one of professional vindication. Your Majesty, the healer said calmly, I believe you and I need to have a conversation about what is happening between you and my apprentice. Casimir did not release Tindra. He did not even lift his head. Whatever it is, he said into her hair, I do not care. She stays. Oh, you absolutely do care, Vedrana replied, because what is happening is a mate bond, and if you keep fighting it, you will both be dead. Before the season turns, Casimir went very still. Tindra, pressed against his chest, felt the exact moment the word registered, mate. She felt his heartbeat stutter, felt the sharp intake of breath, felt the way his whole body went still around her. She pulled back just enough to look at his face. His eyes were wide and blazing with something that looked like hope being dragged back from the edge of extinction. You knew, she said softly. Somewhere in there, you already knew. His hand came up to cup her face. His thumb traced the dark circle beneath her eye, evidence of the damage his absence had inflicted, and the guilt that flooded his expression nearly broke her heart. "I suspected," he admitted, his voice so low she had to lean closer to hear. "I prayed I was wrong. Why?" His jaw clenched. "Because I am a curse, Tindra. Everything I touch, I destroy. And a mate bond would mean you are bound to the most dangerous wolf alive. It would mean I can never let you go without killing you. It would mean your fate is chained to mine, and mine is not a fate I would wish on anyone." "That," Tindra said firmly, "is not your decision to make." He searched her face. She did not waver. "And for the record," she continued, "you have touched me every day for weeks, and the only thing you have destroyed is my ability to sleep in a bed that does not smell like you." His mouth opened. Something behind his eyes gave way. Entirely. He pulled her back against his chest and held her so tightly she could feel his ribs pressing against hers, his face buried in her neck, his breath uneven. His whole frame, straining with the effort of holding together. "Do not leave," he whispered. "Please, do not leave." Tindra wrapped her arms around him and held on. "Never," she said. "Not ever." Above them, from a second-floor window, Hallion turned to Lord Marin with an expression of intense relief. Finally, the beta muttered. Lord Marin blew his nose loudly into a handkerchief and said nothing at all. Vedrana examined them both in the infirmary that afternoon, ignoring the king's protests, with the calm authority of a woman who had been treating scraped knees and bruised egos since before he was born. "The bond is forming whether you cooperate or not," Vedrana told Casimir bluntly, pressing 2 fingers to his wrist to check his pulse. "Resisting it is like resisting breathing. You can manage it for a while, but eventually the body wins." "I am not resisting," Casimir said stiffly. "Your Majesty, you are sitting on my examination table, with your arms crossed and your jaw clenched so tight, I can hear your teeth grinding from here. You are the definition of resisting." Vedrana released his wrist and turned to Tindra. "And you are dehydrated, malnourished, and your wolf is so agitated I am surprised you are not vibrating." "I feel fine," Tindra said. Vedrana looked at the ceiling as if asking a higher power for patience. "You are both impossible. You deserve each other." The words landed differently than she intended. Tindra glanced at Casimir and found him already looking at her. Something passed between them, quick and electric, and they both looked away. That evening, Tindra returned to the king's chambers. Not the adjacent room, his bed. The arrangement had been reinstated, but everything about it felt different now. The careful distance they had maintained for weeks was gone. In its place was something charged and fragile, humming in the air between them like a string pulled taut. Casimir stood by the window, his back to her, his silhouette cut sharp against the last light of the evening sky. He had changed into a loose linen shirt, and she could see the tension in his shoulders, the braced set of his spine. "Vedrana says the bond needs proximity to stabilize," he said without turning around. "Physical proximity." "I know," Tindra said. "She told me the same." A pause. "She also said that the more complete the bond becomes, the more effectively it will suppress the surges." "I know that too." Another pause. Longer this time. "I do not know how to do this," he said quietly. Tindra moved closer. "Do what?" He turned, and the expression on his face stripped her bare. Vulnerability so raw, it looked like pain. "Be close to someone." "I have spent 14 months training myself to keep distance between my body and every living thing. I have conditioned myself to flinch away from contact, to suppress every instinct that reaches for another person." His voice dropped. "And now the one thing that might save me is the thing I have spent a year teaching myself not to want." Tindra stood in front of him, close enough to touch, and felt the connection thrum between them like a second heartbeat. "Then, stop teaching yourself," she said. "It is not that simple. It is exactly that simple. She reached up slowly, giving him time to pull away. He did not. Her palm settled against his chest, over his heart, and she felt the sharp intake of breath that shuddered through him. Your body knows how to do this. Your wolf knows how to do this. You are the one getting in the way. His hand came up and covered hers, pressing her palm harder against his chest. You do not understand what you are to me, he said, and his voice had gone rough in a way that made her stomach tighten. Before you, the last thing I touched was a weapon. The last person who stood this close to me was a soldier I was carrying off a battlefield. His throat worked. And then you walked into a room and looked at me like I was just a man. Not a king, not a weapon, not a curse. Just a man. You are just a man, Tindra whispered. I am not. I am the thing that empties rooms. The thing that makes grown wolves bleed from their ears. You are the only person alive who can stand in front of me and not break, and I am terrified that if I let myself have this, I will ruin it, the way I ruin everything. Tindra rose onto her toes and kissed him. His response was not immediate. For one agonizing heartbeat, he stood perfectly still, his hand frozen over hers on his chest. Every muscle went taut. Then the resistance dissolved. His hands slid into her hair, cradling her head, tilting her face toward his. And he kissed her back with a hunger that stole the breath from her lungs. The connection blazed. She felt it flare in her chest, like a flame catching dry wood, spreading outward through her body until every nerve was alight. She could feel him through it now, not just his presence, but his emotions. The immense depth of what he felt for her, the longing he had been crushing for weeks, the terror of wanting something this much after a year of having nothing. Tell me to stop, he said against her mouth, his hands sliding down to her waist, drawing her closer. No, Tindra breathed. He lifted her. She wrapped her arms around his neck, and he carried her to the bed, laying her down with a gentleness that contradicted every hard, dangerous thing the world believed about him. His weight settled over her and she pulled him closer, needing the contact, needing more, needing everything. What followed was tender and overwhelming, and nothing like she had imagined and everything she had needed. He was careful with her in a way that made her want to weep. His hands reverent, every touch a question and an answer at once. And when the moment came, it swept through both of them together, and Tindra felt the bond complete itself. It was like a door opening inside her chest. Warmth flooded in, golden and vast, connecting her to him in a way that went beyond skin, beyond words, beyond anything she had a name for. His heartbeat echoed through her, as if it were her own. The relief pouring through him, the relief of a man who had been alone in the dark for over a year, and had finally been found. He marked her. The mating bond, instinctive and claiming, sealed at the curve of her neck, and the connection locked into place with an almost audible snap. Tindra claimed him in return, her mark, finding the juncture of his shoulder, and she felt his response vibrate through the bond like a bell struck clean. They lay tangled together afterward, breathing hard, her head on his chest, his arm wrapped around her waist. The dominance that had been a constant oppressive presence for 14 months was quiet. Not gone, but settled. Like a storm that had finally exhausted itself. Is it always like that? Tindra murmured against his skin. I have no idea, Casimir said. I have never done this before. She lifted her head and watched him. What? The flush that crept up his neck was deeply, profoundly satisfying. Before the surges, I could not risk the intimacy, and after them, I could not touch anyone at all. Tindra pressed her face back into his chest to hide the enormous smile that spread across her face. Well, she said, her voice muffled, for a first effort, that was quite acceptable. Quite acceptable, he repeated flatly. Adequate. Satisfactory, passable. His arm drew her closer, and she felt his chest shake with silent laughter. Then his hand slid into her hair, and his voice dropped to something low and warm and certain. "Stay with me," he said. "Not as an arrangement, not as a healer as mine. I am already yours," Tindra whispered. "I have been yours since you grabbed my wrist in that corridor and forgot to let go." He pulled her closer still. Sleep claimed him. And for the first time since the war that had broken him open, Casimir Valen fell asleep without fear. Tindra followed him into sleep, moments later. She did not dream of the infirmary, or the herb garden, or the narrow bed in the lower keep. She dreamed of a scorched field beneath a sky full of smoke. The battlefield stretched in every direction, black and silent. But it was different this time. The completed bond pulsed between them. Like a shared heartbeat, warm and steady, and Tindra could feel Casimir beside her, even before she turned her head. He was there. Not the gutted, diminished version she had seen in his memory before. He was himself present and aware, his hand already reaching for hers. "You are here," he said, and she heard both wonder and dread in his voice. "We are here together," Tindra corrected, lacing her fingers through his. The connection between us. The smoke drifted low across the ground, obscuring the worst of it, but she could still see shapes in the distance. Bodies. The cost of the siege laid out in every direction. The ground beneath her bare feet was soft, in a way that felt wrong, yielding like something alive that did not want to be stepped on. "Why does your wolf bring you back here?" Tindra asked softly. Casimir did not answer. His jaw was tight, his gaze fixed on the center of the field where a thin figure was emerging from the smoke. The woman. Tindra recognized her from the first vision. Small, dark-haired, her arms wrapped protectively around the child, pressed against her chest. They were not moving this time. They stood still in the smoke, watching the king with eyes that held no accusation, only waiting. "She was a villager from Harrowmere," Casimir said, his voice low and controlled. "A settlement on the edge of the Scarvane territory. When the battle moved toward them, the villagers tried to flee. She was running with her son toward our lines, toward safety." He swallowed. "My dominance reached them before they made it." Tindra squeezed his hand. Her name was Evelyn. The boy was called Piers. He was 4 years old. The specificity of it, the names, the age, the way he said them like he had carved them into his own bones, told her everything. He had memorized them. Not just these two, but all of them. Every face. He carried them like stones in his chest, and every night his wolf dragged him back here to count them again. More figures materialized from the smoke. Soldiers in torn uniforms. Civilians in nightclothes, dragged from their beds by the chaos. A boy barely old enough to hold a sword. An old man clutching a walking stick. They gathered at the edges of the field, in a silent, patient semicircle, and Casimir watched each one appear with the expression of a man reading a list he had memorized long ago. "I know all their names," he said quietly. "Everyone." Tindra felt tears burning behind her eyes. "How many?" 213. The number hung in the smoky air between them. "Your wolf is not punishing you," Tindra said, the understanding arriving with sudden and absolute clarity. "It is trying to fix it. It replays the moment over and over because it is searching for the decision that saves everyone. The one where you unleash your power and Evelyn still makes it to safety, and Piers still grows up." Casimir flinched. "But that decision does not exist," Tindra continued, her voice gentle but unflinching. "There was no version of that day where everyone survived. The Scarvane would have slaughtered your people if you had not ended it. Your wolf cannot accept that, so it keeps replaying and replaying, and every time it fails to find a better answer, the grief compounds, the dominance grows, and you let it grow because you believe you deserve it." His hand was unsteady in hers. She held on tighter. "I know what that feels like," she said. "Not the war, not the power, but the believing you deserve it, the part where you decide the pain is earned. I was left on the steps of the lower keep as an infant. Tindra said, and the words came easier than she expected. No note, no name, no explanation, just a baby in a wool blanket that nobody wanted. And I spent my entire life trying to earn the right to exist, trying to be useful enough, quiet enough, good enough that no one else would leave me. Her eyes burned. I told myself the abandonment was my fault. That, if I had been better, they would have stayed. I carried that stone in my chest for 23 years, Casimir. I know exactly how heavy it gets. The smoke around them thinned. She felt it respond to their connection, to the truth, passing between them, like a current. But it was never my fault, Tindra said. Their leaving said everything about them, and nothing about me. And what happened on this field? She gestured at the scorched ground, at Evelyn and Piers standing silent in the fading smoke. Says everything about war, and nothing about you. I killed them, Casimir said, and his voice broke on the words. You ended a siege that would have killed 10 times more if it had continued. You made an impossible choice, and you saved your kingdom, and you lost people in the process. And that is the most terrible thing a leader can carry. But carrying it does not mean drowning in it forever. She turned to face him fully, both hands gripping his now. You are allowed to grieve them. You are allowed to say their names. You are allowed to remember Evelyn and Piers every single day for the rest of your life. But you are not allowed to die for them. Not when there are people alive right now who need you. People like you, he whispered. People like me, she confirmed, tears running down her face. People like Hadion, who has spent 14 months watching his king disappear. People like Lord Marin, who stuffs cotton up his nose every morning and comes to council anyway because he believes in you. People like every wolf in that castle, who is terrified and loyal and waiting for their king to come back to them. She watched him fight it. Watched the muscles in his jaw clench, watched his throat work, watched the war play out across his face between the part of him that believed he deserved this suffering and the part of him that wanted so desperately to put it down. You have been holding this for 14 months, Tindra said, her voice barely above a whisper. You have held it alone, in silence, in a sealed wing of a castle where no one could reach you. And I am telling you now that you do not have to hold it alone anymore. I am here, let me carry it with you. Casimir's face gave way, not all at once. It was like watching a dam develop fractures, thin lines spreading outward from a single point until the whole structure could no longer hold. His eyes filled, his mouth twisted. His shoulders dropped, and the tension that had been wound through his body for over a year released in a single, shuddering exhale. He dropped to his knees in the scorched grass, and Tindra went with him, wrapping her arms around him as the first real sob tore through his body. He wept, not quietly, not with restraint. He wept the way a man weeps when a year of grief finally finds its way out, ugly and raw and shaking. His face pressed against her shoulder, his hands fisting in the back of her shirt. Tindra held him and did not let go. Around them the battlefield began to change. The smoke cleared, the black grass softened, faded, turned to pale gray, then to something close to green. The bodies dissolved into the earth, like morning frost under sunlight. The civilians. The old man. The boy. Evelyn and Piers were the last to go. The woman looked at Casimir, at the man on his knees, in the arms of the woman who loved him, no longer a king or a weapon or a curse, but simply a man who was finally allowing himself to grieve. And for just a moment, something that looked like peace settled across her features. She pressed her lips to the top of her son's head. Then they were gone. The field was empty. The sky above was clearing, smoke giving way to pale thin light that grew brighter as Tindra watched. The bond between them pulsed, steady and warm and whole. Casimir's sobs slowed, his breath evened, his grip on her loosened but did not release. She ran her fingers through his hair and murmured words that did not matter, sounds meant only to remind him that she was there. "I have got you," she whispered. "I am here." The light grew brighter. The scorched field faded beneath them. They woke in his bed, in his chambers, wrapped so tightly around each other that she could not tell where her body ended and his began. Dawn light filtered through the curtains, warm and golden, and the air in the room was still, not heavy, not dense, not thick, with the suffocating weight of uncontrolled dominance, just still, peaceful, clean. He was looking at her with eyes that were red-rimmed and swollen and more open than she had ever seen them. He cupped her face in both hands and touched his forehead gently to hers. "Thank you," he breathed. Tindra smiled through her own tears and kissed him softly. "You are welcome." They lay there in the growing light, breathing together, and neither of them spoke for a long time. There was nothing left to say that the bond had not already said for them. The dominance did not vanish overnight. It receded slowly over the weeks and months that followed, like a tide pulling back from a shore it had battered for too long. There were difficult nights. Mornings when Casimir woke, with clenched fists and a racing heart, remnants of the battlefield surfacing in fragments that no longer formed a complete picture but still carried sharp edges. She held him when he needed holding, and talked when he needed sound, and sat in steady silence when he needed nothing but her presence beside him. And gradually, painfully, the dominance learned to rest. The first sign of real change came 3 weeks after the bond was sealed. Casimir was walking through the east wing, which had been reopened cautiously, with Tindra at his side. A servant carrying a stack of folded linens came around a corner and nearly walked into them. The woman froze. Her eyes went wide, her body bracing for the crushing wave of pressure that always preceded the king. Nothing happened. The servant blinked, looked at the king, looked at Tindra, looked at the linens in her arms, as if confirming that reality was still functioning. "Your Majesty," she said, and then, because she clearly could not help herself, that did not hurt at all. Casimir's expression barely shifted, but Tindra felt the surge of emotion through the bond. Relief so acute, it bordered on pain. She slipped her hand into his and squeezed. "Thank you for the update," the king said to the bewildered servant, and kept walking. The council sessions returned to their full length. Commander Jessamine stopped quivering. The royal treasurer walked into the chamber, sat down, and completed an entire budget review without fleeing. Lord Marin declared, with characteristic understatement, that the king seemed to be in improved spirits. "Improved?" Hadion echoed later, shaking his head. "The man is sleeping through the night, eating 3 meals a day, and I caught him humming in his study yesterday." Improved does not begin to cover it. Tindra laughed when Halion told her that, and the beta smiled at her with such warmth that she had to look away before the tears came. Their mating was announced to a court that had been whispering about it for weeks. A foundling Omega, with no name and no bloodline, bonded to the most powerful alpha in recorded history. The scandal was magnificent. The whispers followed Tindra through every corridor and into every room. Some were cruel. An herbalist from the lower keep playing at being queen, a clever girl who had exploited a king's weakness to climb above her station. The words found their way to her, as words always do, carried on the breath of servants and the sideways glances of nobles who thought they were being subtle. Tindra absorbed them the way she absorbed most things, quietly and with her chin up. She had spent 23 years being an orphan in a castle full of families. She knew how to carry the weight of not belonging. But Casimir did not absorb them quietly. His response was to hold her hand at every public function and level a gaze at anyone whose look lingered too long on his mate. A gaze that suggested he was calculating the precise arc of trajectory required to remove them from the room through the nearest window. "They will adjust," he told her one evening, pulling her close in the privacy of their chambers. And if they do not? Tindra asked. Then they can take the matter up with their king, he said, against her temple, who is entirely and irrevocably besotted with his mate and has no interest whatsoever in pretending otherwise. Besotted, Tindra repeated, smiling. That is a very strong word, Your Majesty. It is an accurate word, he corrected. I consulted Hadion. He suggested enamored. I felt it was insufficient. She laughed against his chest, and he held her tighter, and the thread between them hummed with a warmth that never quite faded. Vedrana was the first person Tindra told about the pregnancy. The old healer looked at her for a long moment, and then her face did something Tindra had never seen it do in 23 years of knowing her. It softened completely, every line and angle dissolving into an expression of such open tenderness that Tindra burst into tears on the spot. Well, Vedrana said, pulling her apprentice into a fierce embrace. It is about time this castle had something to celebrate. Casimir's reaction was quieter, but no less devastating. She told him in the evening, in their chambers, sitting on the edge of their bed. He went very still. Then he knelt in front of her, took both her hands, and pressed his face against her stomach, without saying a word. She felt his shoulders shake. She ran her fingers through his hair and let him stay there for as long as he needed. I did not think I would ever have this, he said finally, his voice rough. Neither did I, Tindra whispered. He looked up at her, and the expression on his face was one she would remember for the rest of her life. Not gratitude, not joy, though both were there. Certainty. The deep, unshakable certainty of a man who had finally stopped believing he did not deserve to be happy. The wedding was held in the great hall on a morning in early autumn. Tindra wore a dress that Vedrana had spent 2 months insisting she did not cry while sewing, though the stitching along the left sleeve suggested otherwise. Hadion stood at the king's side and managed to maintain his composure until the vows, at which point he turned away and pressed a handkerchief to his face with great dignity. Lord Marin wept openly and without apology into his own handkerchief. Commander Jessamine, who had never been seen displaying emotion in her entire military career, was observed blinking rather rapidly during the exchange of rings. And Casimir, the most feared alpha in the known world, the man whose mere presence had once emptied rooms and brought warriors to their knees, stood at the front of his own great hall and spoke his vows in a voice that did not waver once. His eyes, never leaving the face of the woman who had walked into a garrison, looked right through his power. And seen him, months later, Tindra stood in that same garrison hall where it had all begun. The same hearth, the same stone walls, the same long wooden benches where she had once knelt beside a wounded soldier and wrapped a bandage without looking up. She was early. The hall was filling gradually, wolves filing in for the king's quarterly address to the garrison. She watched them enter, watched the way they moved through the space with easy confidence. No hunched shoulders, no cotton stuffed in nostrils, no page boys with their heads between their knees. The doors opened, Casimir stepped through, and every wolf in the room bowed, not because the pressure forced them to their knees, not because their wolves screamed at them to submit. They bowed because he was their king, and they chose to honor him. And the difference between fear and respect was written in every steady spine and dry nose and clear eye in the room. Casimir's gaze found hers across the hall. She did not bow, she never had, he smiled. And Tindra smiled back, her hand resting lightly on the swell of her stomach, where something small and new and impossible was just beginning to grow.